This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
So, to me, the Stoics and Seneca are saying you are responsible for how you react to the things that you have no control over. Why would you not want to take hold of that? The one thing that you have that you can control.
Welcome to America Daily. I'm Jessica Beatty. We've all heard the saying, be kind. You don't know what someone's going through. And if you're human, then you've probably had your share of bad days. Ancient philosophers thought a lot about the nature of pain and suffering, and we could learn a thing or two from them today. America Daily contributor Timothy Gebhardt has a wonderful interview about this topic. It inspired me to take a fresh look at life's challenges, and I'm sure it will inspire you as well. Here's Tim's interview with artist Bess.
The course of our lives can be likened to that of leaves on a tree. In spring, we bloom, then face the harsh winds and storms and the blazing heat of summer. And when autumn approaches, we wither and fall. Suffering is a part of the human condition, and throughout all these seasons, and on a daily basis, we go through small ordeals to major life-changing traumas. This is a reality we all face, and according to Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, meditating on life and the human condition will help us calmly accept the hardships that prevail in our lives. We're going to be diving into this topic in more depth with Bess. He's a practicing representational artist. He's currently a doctoral student at the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, and he's a writer on art, culture, and philosophy. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, just a brief background on Seneca. He was a Roman Stoic philosopher who lived around 60 AD. He was one of the principal tutors to the infamous Emperor Nero, who would later become one of the most corrupt emperors in Roman history. Could you talk about their relationship?
The first 5 years of their relationship was good, and Seneca actually had a lot of hope for Nero. He thought that Nero showed a lot of promise, despite his inability to teach him Stoic philosophy. He still thought that maybe this young kid was the real deal. He even wrote a book, or a little treatise, I guess, called On Mercy, where he just talks about what a good emperor is and how Nero shows that kind of promise, and how a merciful person or a merciful ruler is one who, in letting transgressions go, rises above the people who transgress, and so that they're actually the good ones, or the higher ones up on the hierarchy, instead of the ones who would exercise vengeance upon people who would, do wrong to them. Seneca was very hopeful. It was only a little bit later that Seneca and Burrus both find out that Nero had been using the two of them to sort of have them step in between his mother's influence. His mother was very active in his politics, in Nero's politics. And in doing so, he was able to arrange for the murder of his mother. Burrus died shortly after that, and Seneca no longer wants anything to do with Nero. He doesn't want to be in politics at all. He now just wants to go off and enjoy a simple life. But Nero refuses to let that happen. And it's shortly after that there's a conspiracy that begins, called the Pisonian conspiracy, to execute Nero. Nero accuses Seneca of being involved in it, which there's no evidence of that at all, and condemns him to death by suicide. And so Seneca, without complaint, accepts that and goes through it.
You talk about Seneca's Stoicism and what he was teaching Nero. What were the Stoic beliefs that Seneca was trying to pass down to his young disciple?
Yes. So as far as he was teaching Nero, he was just mostly teaching Nero how to speak well. So he would write his speeches for him. Very political. Let me write this speech so that when you get up and present it to the populace, everyone thinks you sound great. Um, but outside of that, his influence wasn't much on Nero. He was hoping Nero would not become a tyrant and give away some of his power back to the Senate, which originally he did. But anyway, as far as his Stoicism is concerned, Seneca and most of the Stoics, which I find this very fascinating, they are in conflict with the Epicureans at the time. And Epicureans sort of believe that the main focus of life is pleasure. You can moderate your way of living in such a way that you experience pleasurable moments until death. But the Stoics believe that the most important thing in life is not pleasure, but virtue. A person who lives a virtuous life will experience happiness. And when they don't experience it, they will not experience unhappiness. So the Stoics sort of they believe that ethics is the best course of action. But in this, there's a whole system of belief that's adopted. And this system of belief, very briefly, is sort of goes like this: that there is the way to be virtuous is by aligning oneself with nature. And by nature, they mean something like the universe or God or Zeus. And they seem to use these words interchangeably. But they don't mean in an immaterial substance. They believe that whatever this is exists in all of the material around us all of the time, and it's constantly determining everything that happens in our lives and throughout the history of the world. So all past events have led up to this present event without our control, and all of these present events will lead to future events without our control. Instead, it's this nature that seems to make all of these things happen. And so they greatly believe in fate, that everything that happens just happens, and the Stoic accepts it without complaint. And that provides a certain degree of peace. If you fight against these things and attempt to control them, you'll find very quickly that you don't have any control over them, and what you end up giving to yourself is nothing but pain and suffering. So in order to alleviate that, you accept everything that happens to you. The only thing that you can control, according to Seneca and Stoics, is yourself, is your mind. And so virtue becomes adopting a mind that makes correct decisions. And those correct decisions can only be had by way of rational thought. In other words, you have to think out something in order for it to be correct. And this is why Stoics deny emotion. They want to completely, especially Seneca. I think he has a quote, I'm probably slightly misquoting this, but it's something along the lines of trying to moderate emotion is like trying to moderate insanity. But he thought that there's the best thing to do is, once the emotion arises, to get rid of it and then reflect on why it showed up in the first place.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I think I've read this quote by him too, where he gets into where, yeah, at the outset of an emotion, it's best to get rid of it, because otherwise it will build and it will try to take on a life of its own and won't try to relinquish itself. It'll build and build and build to where it defines you as a person.
Yeah, it's like the emotion feeds itself. And then it interferes with your ability to make a rational decision, which would be a correct decision. So for the Stoics, it's not even that emotion is irrational, it's just incorrect. It will not allow you to make a correct decision. And if you can't make correct decisions, then you cannot be virtuous. And if you cannot be virtuous, you will never be happy.
Yeah, and Seneca, what's interesting about him is his take on things that in the normal course of life, we would try to steer away from suffering, and we would, follow our emotions. But he went in the kind of the exact opposite direction, especially, with suffering, because he basically said, by applying pain to the body or mind, we correct dispositions which have been made crooked by vice. So he's saying that suffering can actually, it can temper the spirit, straighten it. I think he used the analogy of like the spear shaft. You straighten it out by heating it, putting moisture on it, bending it, so you get this nice straight arrow shaft. So that suffering, that applying, is what you need to straighten it out, make it good, make it workable. So he was applying that to the human condition. So in Stoic philosophy, how do they view the human condition? Because he gets into a lot of these things that kind of are the opposite of, at least in the modern sense, what we would think of being a good life, a virtuous life. So, again, like, how does Seneca see people living a virtuous life? You talked about living in accordance to nature. What does that look like?
I think that for Seneca, it would it would be to if something bad happens or suffering happens, it's revealing to you, at least in emotional sense, it's revealing to you ways that you are not yet rational. And so if you're trying to be rational, the best way to know if you're not rational is, or the best way to become rational is to know when you're not being rational. And suffering is what exposes that.
Oh, interesting.
So, there's a way that you can, or I think there's another quote by him. I'm grossly paraphrasing here, but it's something like, at the end of every day, sit and go over all of the things that you didn't do well, where you weren't virtuous, where you weren't being a decent person, et cetera, where you weren't being rational, because exposing these things are a way that you'll grow as a person. So in a way, it's almost like a self-improvement manual. I feel like if he were alive today, he'd be in the self-help section of your local Barnes and Noble. But I think that's kind of what it would look like. It's sort of like a meditation on, or a self-reflection on, how we day to day are responding to the things in our everyday lives. And so, I know quite a few people who, when they're driving, for instance, and someone cuts them off, or someone isn't driving how they think they should drive, they become upset, they become angry, and they begin to take those frustrations out on the other driver. But Seneca would say you can't control that other driver. Instead, if anything, that driver has exposed something in you that is not rational. And since it's not rational, it's causing you pain and potential pain to the people around you and the environment around you. But if you reflect on that, if you recognize it immediately, expose it, and reflect on it, then you're one step closer to just being a rational being.
So how did these concepts of Stoics, do you think they're, people are applying these to basically their lives? So, of Stoicism, Seneca applied Stoic philosophy, and that guided his entire life thereafter. Whereas in the modern sense, we might say, what's the modern view of how to live and how those concepts can affect us?
I would say that we probably have, and there's probably a lot of people who disagree with me on this, but I think we have a more Epicurean approach to our lives right now, in that we want to enjoy what's pleasurable. That's how we think we will get our lives. Epicurus, though, would probably say that we're going to extremes, which is why there's such a high degree of unhappiness today. Because even though Epicurus wanted or argued for pleasure, he seemed to mean that this pleasure comes from moderation, so that if somebody pursues the to be in Hawaii drinking their Mai Tais or whatever on a beach looking at the waves, they spend their whole life pursuing that. They have not experienced any happiness because of their pursuit. They have instead lived an extreme, full of angst, and have experienced a lot of suffering because of that. Instead, the pleasurable life comes from moderation. You sort of sit in the in between of extremes and enjoy just the day to day moments of life, the wind blowing, looking into another person's eyes, just the day to day occurrences. The Stoics instead would say that's not going to provide you pleasure because it's easy to get addicted to that. And just like we were talking earlier, Seneca says once that emotion starts, it can take a life of its own. And before you know it, you're being dragged along with it instead of controlling yourself. So for them, virtue was the most important thing. Uh, this argument seems to develop throughout all of Western history up until today. In philosophical circles, and how those philosophies end up influencing culture and politics. So it's really interesting. These two things seem to be the extremes: emotion or intellect. Which one is better? Or law or emotion, or law or culture? Which one is better? Which one would be better to have in society and have us learn from and be influenced by? A lot of people say it's rule of law, and having the intellect be what's the dominant form of learning in society. But then a lot of people say that just led to science, like just hardcore science, where myth was completely taken out of it, spirituality was completely taken out of it, emotion was completely taken out of it, and it left a lot of human beings suppressing those things. And that excess buildup resulted in war, some of the most devastating wars that we've ever seen. And then the other extreme is going deep into that and creating your own myths, your own religions, and your own spiritualities, all based in emotion, and how that might determine culture, which has its own problems. It can become very problematic when you only see the world through your own eyes, and you aren't able to rationally consider how you could be affecting other human beings. So I think both extremes are, I don't know, they both come with problems. The thing is, though, is that if I say that, I would say that they both come with problems if they're not rationally thought through.
Yeah.
Which brings me right back to Stoicism.
So Seneca in the Stoics, you said they were trying to conform to nature, to what might be interpreted as God or Zeus or something like that. So can you give us an idea of what that looks like?
Yeah, so it appears that what they mean by nature is actually just the rational. So by nature, they kind of mean fate, and or at least nature determines everything that happens. So in a way, it's kind of like, let's see, there's a car plant that's creating cars, or the parts for cars, and there's a bunch of workers creating all of these parts. And all of these parts are checked and then sent to a facility where they're put together in a car. And then the car is sent to a facility where it's painted. And then after it's painted, it's sent to a dealership. And then one day your car breaks down because you had to drive to meet a friend in a city 2 hours away. and in it breaking down, you needed to purchase a new car. So you go to the dealership to buy the new car. The Stoic says you have no control over any of that. All of that is fated by this thing called nature. It's going to happen in this way. It's just going to happen. There's nothing you can do about it. It's all going to happen this way. And whatever's going to happen tomorrow is going to happen that way too. Everything is going to happen the way it's going to happen. And this is because of it's rational. So it's cause and effect. So A leads to B, and B leads to C, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we, as human beings, if we want to align with nature, which would make us virtuous, we too need to be rational. We have to think out cause and effect. What from A, or how does A lead to B? How does B lead to C? And et cetera, et cetera. And this is why self-reflection is so important. You can't reflect when you're emotional. You're just acting, you're impulsive, you're whatever's happening in that moment, you're just responding to it. And those things are not virtuous if emotion is their cause. So the Stoic and Seneca would say, you instead of becoming emotional, you think this through, just like nature has sort of planned cause and effect. And that way you're aligning with nature. And if you think it through, you'll be able to act in alignment with nature. You'll be able to act in accordance with nature and thus be virtuous.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I heard that this is from, a fellow artist like yourself, where she said everything has a design, and that just blew me away. Like, everything has a very specific design. So if we look at, the leaves on the trees, they're designed in a specific way. Everything on our planet, people, all the life and everything is designed in a very specific way. It's kind of like that A to B. So do you think this kind of goes into where, as you said, everything's planned, even as you said, the past and the future, all that stuff. Do you think that's entwined in there?
Yes. So I think as far as the Stoic is concerned, yes. They would say that everything like that, the way a plant is made up, the creatures that are here on earth, the way they are designed, the way things are organized, everything happens with a reason. Everything sort of, nothing is coincidental, and nothing happens by way of chance. Nothing is spontaneous. Everything happens because nature wants it to happen.
Wow.
Nature is having it happen that way.
Okay. So, we as, us just strolling along life, it almost feels like nature or some facsimile, whatever you want to call it. My personal life, it's trying to like have me enlightened to this, like every year, or, twice a year even, my life gets completely upended, where I have completely no control of everything. I just have to, it's where I get into a new situation where I it's usually financial, where I'm like, how am I going to live? I'm going to spend, next month I could be living under a bridge kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no control. And it always kind of works out. And there's always lessons to learn. My ego is usually punched,
Mm-hmm.
like nature is punching me like a punching bag. And so, it's hard to let go in those situations where you don't have any control. But here Seneca is saying, well, yeah, you don't. Get over it. And how do you make of that? Because it seems like it's just a human response, where if somebody's coming at you with a baseball bat, you want to duck. How would you understand this?
I think I think it's personally a fantastic thing, because it gives responsibility to the person who's experiencing the misfortune, even though it's completely out of your control, which seems to be a contradiction. But for the Stoic, it isn't, because you can't control nature, but you can control yourself. And just a moment ago, we were talking about sort of like our modern times and how things may be now, and we have a tendency now to shift blame, where personal responsibility isn't something that is adopted. It's usually more, we're more likely nowadays to blame the environment somehow.
Is this like a victim kind of thing?
Yes, yeah. So we'll blame our situation, or we'll blame the government, or there's someone else to blame other than ourselves. And Seneca would say, well, what's the point of blaming everyone else? That does, just like the person who may cut you off. You can blame them for your current misfortune, but or even how you feel right now. But that's actually not truth. It's just not true. The reason you feel the way you feel is because you're holding an incorrect view. If you change that viewpoint, then you'll also change your response to the occurrence. That occurrence could happen 1,000 times. And each time it happens, even though it's exactly the same, your reaction to it can change based on the principles and beliefs that you hold. So, to me, the Stoics and Seneca are saying you are responsible for how you react to the things that you have no control over. Why would you not want to take hold of that? The one thing that you have that you can control. Why would you not want to practice controlling it? Why would you not want to master that one thing? And so I find it quite incredible.
I hope you enjoyed Tim's interview with artist Eric Bess. Did it make you think any differently about life's challenges? You can let us know what you think on our Facebook page at AD Top Story of the Day. Once again, I'm Jessica Beatty. Thanks for listening to America Daily. Until next time.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.